Bet the Board podcast, powered by FanDuel Sportsbook, NFL Week 14, Monday Night Football edition, as we put a bow on the week that was with the Cardinals and Rams. I'm your host, Todd Furman, joined as always by my esteemed colleague and co-host, the one, the only Payne Insider. But before we kick things off this Monday morning, encourage all of you, our loyal listeners, head over to FanDuel.com, use the promo code BetTheBoard, take advantage of your $1,000 risk-free bet for new user signups, 30-1 enhanced odds, and a variety of other ways that FanDuel was ready to help you build your bankroll. And Payne, another week of professional football almost in the books. The biggest game of the weekend did not disappoint. It's Tom Brady and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers emerging victorious with a 33-27 overtime triumph against the Buffalo Bills.
Certainly an interesting way to get that win.
That's putting it mildly.
Come out and dominate and then fall asleep at the wheel and allow the Bills to get back into that game. Offensively, we did see some improvement. Just wasn't. I thought Daboll had the right game plan early on, of course, because it wasn't necessarily working early on in terms of execution, right? The Twitter mob was out in full force wanting him to run the ball. But he had the right game plan, stuck with it, and they were able to battle their way back once Tampa kind of fell asleep. And that's the weird part in gauging this game, is because I think a lot of people will come away with saying, hey, Buffalo was the right side there. They were inside the number late, and, you have the touchdown in overtime. It felt more like Tampa just fell asleep, right? Built this 24-3 lead, dominated early. We expected to see some energy and effort early on from Buffalo based upon all of the media transgressions this week, and they were getting just thrown through the mud the first 48 hours post Monday Night Football. That wasn't the case. Now, it's good to see them battle back a little bit, but Tampa got a little conservative, just kind of fell asleep mid-third quarter, and then all of a sudden you get a play or two to go your way, and Buffalo's re-energized again. But that's what makes it difficult assessing the situation, because getting down 24-3, you're saying to yourself, here we go again, right? Like, Buffalo's just an epic fraud at this point. Anytime they've stepped up in class, they've just been drubbed. And so all of a sudden, about 20 minutes of good football, and our perception is Buffalo potentially should have not only covered that game, but had a chance to win it. So that's the tough part for me Monday morning.
Yeah, it's so interesting when you try and break a game like that down where one team is up by 3 touchdowns. And to your point, talking about, is it a bad beat when you give up a 50-plus yard touchdown to Brashad Perriman, who spent more time in different jerseys than I think Gaylord Perry did in his Major League Baseball career. But at the same time, to even be down 3 touchdowns on the road in that kind of spot, the expectation can't be that you're going to get back into it. But maybe Buffalo uses that as a jumping off point as they go into the final 4 games of their schedule. Of course, the big takeaway there, we'll see about Josh Allen's status as he walked to the post-game presser in a boot. Have to imagine he'll miss some practice time this week, but be a full go on Sunday, barring a setback against the Carolina Panthers. But that wasn't the only big comeback we saw, Payne. And I know we normally go through good, bad, and the ugly, highlighting individual or team performances of the positive or negative fashion, but I think it's worth going to Cleveland and Baltimore as well. A game that we saw professional money come in on Cleveland. That thing closed headed towards 3.5 before kickoff. We saw over money come in as well on Sunday morning. The Browns come out with an aggressive game plan, much like you forecasted when we broke the game down on this very podcast last Thursday, but they take their foot off the gas. They allow the Ravens to build momentum, and it's a backup quarterback that marches them in through the back door, covering the closing number, although coming up a bit short. There is one thing I want to touch on this game to get your takeaway. Not so much X's and O's on the field, but the way that Coach Harbaugh was criticized by a lot of the folks in the CBS booth we'll get to in a second. But as far as Cleveland and their execution, were you happy with what you saw from Kevin Stefanski, or a little bit disappointed they couldn't really step on the throat?
Yeah, at 24-3, I understand the thought process, and it's that Tyler Huntley looked miserable late in the second quarter. And you are down, your opponent's down its best player. And so you're thinking to yourself, let's just get back to being a run-first team. In the second half, got very conservative and didn't put a team away. And then I honestly was at a point where I'm watching Tyler Huntley convert these 4th and 6 passes, and I'm thinking to myself, Joe Woods is going to be out of a job if the Ravens pull this off. and just miserable, right? Special teams. You give up an onside kick. We're kind of watching the Browns struggle a little bit in year 2 of Stefanski, right? We've kind of understood that he's this offensive mind and he calls plays, but now people are starting to figure some things out defensively, and now you have to be a head coach. Like, it's just a different ballgame than what he's kind of grown accustomed to in my mind, and he's struggling with that a little bit. Joe Woods, to me, has been a little bit of a disappointment. Had really high hopes for him, but again, the question mark was all of the talent on the defensive side of the ball for San Francisco. When you have 4 and 5 first-round picks along that D-line, certainly makes your job easier as a secondary coach, and we're starting to see the fallout of that a little bit from San Francisco defensively. Not the best work with the New York Jets, right? Not the best work from Joe Woods in Cleveland. Defense regressed as they've had to get rid of some parts along the defensive line in San Francisco this year. So all of the guys that are currently with San Francisco and the guys that have moved on and gotten jobs based upon that Super Bowl run haven't really met expectation at this point. And that's the concerning part about the Browns right now. You have to feel good this morning because Pittsburgh loses on Thursday night. They're a little bit of a train wreck. TJ Watt re-injures the groin. You get your big win against Baltimore, and who knows how long Lamar Jackson's out. And so all of a sudden, you're in prime position. Now, I know the schedule is a little bit difficult, but you are in prime position to not only control your own destiny, but potentially win that division.
It's pretty wild. When you look at the Browns, they were as high as 7-1 out in the market to win that division going into yesterday when some of the prices reopened today. Shorter than 2-1 on some of the betting boards, given some of the ancillary damage. To your point, the Steelers going down on Thursday night despite a valiant comeback against the Vikings. The injury to Lamar Jackson that some folks reported as a lower ankle sprain. Some other sources report as a high ankle sprain. But given the handful of shops that have a number open for their trip to Baltimore, or Green Bay's trip to Baltimore on Sunday, says Lamar ain't going to be out there this week, and we'll see how long he's shelved for. The one thing, though, that I wanted to talk about in this game, and I know we discussed some analytics and game situations and everything else. Some of the old school guys throughout the CBS telecast, and Bill Cowher was best described as apoplectic. When John Harbaugh cuts the game to a 9-point margin at 24-15, elects to go for 2. Now, Harbaugh, to his credit, has always been a little bit more forward-thinking. He's honestly probably more transparent in his post-game press conferences than head coaches should be at this point, talking about why he went for 2 against the Steelers, and again, why he went for 2 in this particular spot. Fair or foul, in your opinion, to try and make it a one-score game there? Do you try and keep the pressure on your opponent at 8, or do you like the move that analytics suggest, knowing, hey, look, we're either going to get it, we're down a touchdown. If we miss, we know we can accelerate our play calling and call a game differently based on being down 2 scores instead of just 1?
I think it's pretty straightforward, right? I mean, it's math. And so you have the media who is not a fan of math, and you have an organization that's analytically sound that's saying we're going to do what the math suggests. It's really that simple. And it's pretty cut and dry. And so credit to Harbaugh for actually entertaining that stuff continually after the game. Everyone always has a great opinion after the fact, right? And this is kind of the business we're in that you're going to lose 45% of the time. You kind of always hear from people after some of the losses. You never hear from them before. And so from a similar ilk, it's the same thing from the media, right? Wouldn't even be a single conversation had the 2-point conversion converted, but it's not. And so that's just where we are. But analytics do suggest, right? The math suggests that is the right play because your goal is to win the game. And that's what it's about, is trying to win the game. And the best way to win the game was going for 2 there. The best way to win a game is also not getting down 24-3.
Well, yeah, I was going to say that's probably the best starting point when you look at things there. But
I mean, that's the question, right? Like, I understand that Lamar Jackson goes down, but once again, your offense continues to struggle early on. And so what is the problem? Those are the questions that should be asked. What's going on offensively? Why aren't we progressing, right? I think we know the answer to that is, your offensive line's dinged up and you don't have a great run game, and Lamar has struggled since week 7. But those aren't the questions, right? Everyone wants to nitpick on why you don't go for 2. The big question is, how do you anticipate and how do you try winning games when you're down 24-3? Why is the offense continuing to just be an absolute dumpster fire early on in games? And so I think you're going to have a situation where we'll see. It's a really, really loyal organization. We know that. Guys tend to last longer than potentially they should when they are in positions to potentially be let go. But there's going to be some interesting times ahead for the offensive coordinator position in Baltimore.
Yeah, I mean, I think Greg Roman, for as innovative as he was getting on the same page as Coach Harbaugh when they instituted Lamar Jackson, this offense is kind of plateaued, and you have to figure out some of your secondary pitches if the offensive line isn't there and the kind of skill sets that you have with the players that are going to impact your wins and losses. And one last thing to
Do you think that's a Greg Roman thing, though? That's always the interesting part to this, is that we constantly knew. I think he's got one of the hardest jobs in the entire NFL. And we can all sit here and say Lamar's great, and listen, he's been fantastic. He's been much better than most people thought he could be.
Put me in that bucket. He's been a hell of a lot better than I ever thought he'd be in this league. No doubt about it.
Yes. And he does have abilities that nobody else has, and he has improved as a passer. There's no doubt about that. But when you look at the injuries, when you look at constantly this is different for me, right? Offensive coordinators definitely have to make adjustments based upon what defenses are giving them. It just feels like Greg Roman has had substantially more variations he's had to come up with offensively, right? When you go out there and you trot out a Peyton Manning or a Tom Brady or a traditional throwing quarterback, there's a million things we can do. Doesn't necessarily feel like that with Lamar Jackson, right? You're just constantly having to come up with something because every single week there's more film on what you want to do, and it's a pretty straightforward offense, right? It's just difficult for Greg Roman right now.
Oh,
I'm not saying he's going to end up getting canned. I do. I think that's ultimately what will happen here if things continue to go awry, and I'm not sure they won't go awry with Tyler Huntley. Obviously, a very good performance in the second half from him, but it's certainly a light version of Lamar Jackson running that offense.
Huntley has been the magic man, coming in relief in this spot, coming up just short against the Cleveland Browns and leading that Herculean effort against the Chicago Bears from the depth of despair. But to your point, and I think, it's one of the things why I wanted to get your take on it. I do love the folks that can't be critical before a decision is made. And I tell people in our industry all the time, if you don't like a bet I'm making, don't wait till the game goes final, because I've never lost a bet when I knew the final score and I had a chance to bet a game. Tell me beforehand why you don't like it, break down the X's and O's, and I'll have a hell of a lot more respect for you. And I think, a lot of these guys in the booth, former players and whatnot, they can describe themselves as old school or whatever terminology you want to use. It's much easier to be a Monday morning quarterback than if you're going to come out before a play and say, hey, I don't like this decision, win or lose. But the reality of things is everything isn't going to be 100% success rate. So don't tell me why something was wrong after the fact. Tell me why it was the wrong decision before, and it allows all of us to be better, smarter, and stronger for it going forward.
Completely agree. I mean, I think that's kind of the day and age we're in. And listen, at the end of the day, a lot of the beat writers are paid to ask these questions. It's what the fans want to know. They are also getting paid by the click. So, Tyler Huntley loses on the road isn't really much headlines. But all of a sudden, if we can question the head coach and his decision-making, I think you get a couple more clicks, probably a few more dollars in your pocket. That's the gist of this.
Yeah, had no idea losing by 2 if you missed the 2-point conversion with 7 minutes to go is different if you miss it with 35 seconds to go. But I can go on and on for this. For a long time, given what some of the folks out there will say when you play for a tie and everything else, which will lead us into one other game where I'll pick your brain on it in a few minutes. But all right, enough minor negativity here. Wanted to know what else stood out to you in a positive fashion over the course of what we've seen so far during Week 14.
I think one of the things, and I see it on your list here, but it's kind of been bugging me a little bit, is Jimmy Garoppolo. I thought he performed pretty well again yesterday. The perception of Jimmy G is always interesting to me, and I think if you could find some consistency there, people's thoughts on him would be drastically different. Ultimately, that's on Kyle Shanahan, right? He's got to sort out the consistency issues with Jimmy G, figure out why some of the underwhelming performances are really, really horrific. And then I think both the performance could be leveled out and then the perception would be drastically different. But I had this conversation with a San Francisco 49ers beat writer, and I just wanted to get his perception on Jimmy G earlier this week. And he wasn't overly high on Jimmy G. And then I sent him a nugget, and he was just astounded. He's like, wow, that's nuts to me. But let me be candid. Like, the reason the 49ers took pro money this week, and take a lot of pro money and respected by pro bettors, it's the dichotomy between perception and reality for Jimmy G. And I think the reality is, if you look at something we do, which is a merging of quarterback dropback EPA and completion percentage above expectation, if you merge those two things together, Jimmy G right now is top 5 in the NFL this season. Only Kyler, Aaron Rodgers, Tom Brady, Teddy Bridgewater, and Stafford have been better. You're looking at Jimmy G right now, T5 with Matthew Stafford. And it's bizarre because even like some of the other metrics, right? If you look at ESPN's QBR model, and I think it's improved, and there's some things within that model that I do like, and there's a lot of sophisticated, sharp guys over there coming up with QBR, but somehow Jimmy G earns a 39 QBR yesterday, yet he's 11th in EPA per dropback and 7th in completion percentage above expectation. There's something going on here where people are having trouble quantifying what Jimmy G is, and some of them are even like the math guys. So it's really interesting, but professional bettors are the reason that game went from 49ers plus 1.5 out to, I saw some even 2.5, 2 at close. So that's just an interesting thing for me, and I want to discuss was Jimmy G, and I thought he was fantastic again yesterday. Now, a little bit of an easier task. Kittle went nuts, and you can attack Cincinnati's defense a little bit over the middle, and certainly I think the ball bounced the 49ers' way early on in that game, whether it was, a key drop on third down from Jamar Chase, which would have set up 1st and 10 at the 49ers 30 as opposed to a punt and a pin, and then you had the muffed punt. And then, I would say a 50-50 call on the initial Jamar Chase touchdown, where certainly the ball does hit the ground, but I think he's got some control there. So 49ers got some breaks early, survived late, and a lot of surviving late was because of Jimmy G.
Yeah, I mean, you watch him week in, week out, and I'm not sure there's a more polarizing quarterback out there that I'm sure maybe half the teams in the league would love to have under center. And I really would like to think there's going to be a big market for teams that feel they're a quarterback away that have the surrounding pieces there. The one thing, my takeaway, though, from you laying out some of the top 5 EPA, I would not have had Teddy Bridgewater up there, so I find that a little bit surprising. But he's done what's been asked of him and put the Denver Broncos in a position to control their own destiny as far as the AFC playoff picture. I know we've praise this unit again, and I don't think we have to spend a lot of time on it, but the Chiefs defense pain continues week in, week out. It's now 6 straight weeks they've held opponents to 17 points or less. In the first 6 drives of that game, they forced 3 punts and 3 Raiders turnovers. They allowed their first points of the game when it was already 35-0. I mean, Spags, it doesn't matter what pieces he has. Your thoughts and prayers went out to L'Jarius Sneed dealing with a family tragedy, wasn't in the mix. Still, this group did not miss a beat, and we'll obviously see how far they've come on Thursday night when they travel out to SoFi Stadium to take on the Chargers.
Yeah, that'll be a big game Thursday night. Some early money trending towards the Chiefs. We'll see ultimately what becomes the side there, but the defensive line, right, continuing to enforce their will. 18 pressures between Chris Jones and Frank Clark. Melvin Gordon added another 4. If you look all told, Derek Carr was pressured on 45% of his dropbacks, and most of it was natural. You mentioned Spags, and he does have this ability to create some very exotic blitz schemes, and it's a very aggressive defense, but Spags only sent blitz 18% of the time yesterday. Carr was under duress most of the day. He was throwing short. We've talked, I think, about Bryan Edwards and Zay Jones not being able to win one-on-one all that often, so the passing game becomes these short throws to Renfro. And certainly he compiled some stats, and he's a great short route runner and gives guys trouble, but that can't be your only avenue of offense, is throwing short to a great route runner in Renfro. Derek Carr had the lowest completed air yards of the week, 2.3. The second lowest was Davis Mills at 3.1. So that paints a picture on how short Derek Carr was throwing. So a lot of non-threatening throws. And when you are down 35-0, you would think, hey, let's push the ball down the field a little bit more. But the offensive line could not prevent pressure. And then there just aren't these threats in the intermediate to deep windows for the Raiders offense right now. So that's basically what transpired yesterday. Is yes, the Chiefs were fantastic. Yes, they were motivated after some pregame tomfoolery from Ngakoue and company on the Chiefs logo. But ultimately, I think the Raiders offense, and we've discussed this, and we discussed it again on Thursday, is not very good right now. It doesn't have a lot of parts. John Gruden is not calling plays, so you've downgraded there, and you've downgraded talent-wise. And so that's kind of what we're seeing from the Raiders offensively right now.
Anything else that you wanted to hit out in a positive manner? I have one or two things, but wanted to give you the floor to make sure that we didn't gloss over anything.
No,
that
you lead the way.
The one thing I will say, I mean, we don't talk a ton about awards, and that's not where I want to go with this discussion, but interesting to see how the potential for Defensive Player of the Year race could shift a little bit. Myles Garrett, we know, is a one-man wrecking crew, but every time, Payne, I watch Micah Parsons out there, I continue to be blown away. I mean, what he did to disrupt that game against the Washington football team and help the Cowboys get out to a 27-0 lead before they had to hang on for dear life on the closing line as a 6.5-point favorite. But the Cowboys getting healthy on the defensive side, I think it's going to make life that much easier for Parson to continue to rack up big numbers over the final 4 weeks of the season.
He's got 28 pressures since week 11. Number one in the NFL by a long mile. And I think we talked specifically about him in this game and just kind of the freak he was getting after the quarterback at Penn State. That was his best attribute, was, as a blitzer. And we've certainly been critical of Dan Quinn over the years, so it's always great when you can praise a guy, and I think we give Dan Quinn some credit here for putting Parsons in position to win. I mean, the first time we saw Micah Parsons, think about this, in Dallas was the Hall of Fame game, where he is getting lost in coverage as a linebacker. Now, Dan Quinn's done just a really, really good job moving him all around and putting him closer to the line of scrimmage and having him as a blitzer. And you mentioned that early game-changing play, I believe it was late in the first quarter, where he causes a strip sack for touchdown, 18-0, get out to a big lead. And, that's difficult for Washington's offense to try to come back in a situation like that. They're not built to come back from 18 behind. And if you look at that play specifically, Dan Quinn goes with a 5-man defensive line where Parsons is set up just right of the left end. And it's a crazy pressure situation. Now, all of a sudden, you have this situation where you have DeMarcus Lawrence, you have Randy Gregory, and you have Micah Parsons that can all get after the quarterback. And I think that's going to change really the defense here for Dallas. I mean, they can get after the quarterback. That's something that is very difficult to do, and it just helps all the other components of your defense. And I think that's the interesting part, is looking at the coverage as well. And I think that's one thing we outlined, was like, shockingly, we were not as high on the secondary early on in the season, when a lot of the anomaly type stuff we knew couldn't continue with Diggs and the interceptions and the defensive scores and whatnot. But that was a unit that's held up pretty well. And I think, honestly, if you look at the Cowboys in general right now, one of their units is trending well and the other one is not. And it's, I think, a shock to most people.
Yeah, defense definitely headed in the right direction. The offense still very much operating in fits and spurts with a backfield that's banged up. We'll see what the Cowboys bring forth with a favorable schedule, at least for this coming Sunday, before they'll wrap up within the division. So no doubt this Dallas Cowboys defense has been a lot better than advertised in recent weeks. With the good pain comes the bad, and I know we've highlighted a couple of things that I had marked down initially, talking about the Bills' slow start and the Cleveland Browns' second half offensive performance, so wanted to know if there were things that stood out to you.
Yeah, I think Cam Newton, right? That's one where you start to question why he was brought in, and I think ultimately that could land Matt Rule in some hot water. We'll see if he's able to survive this season. But you just start to wonder what's going on there. I mean, benched again for PJ Walker, and initially it looks good. The opening script off the bye, you would expect to be pristine, and it was. And you get him moving with his legs, and again, it looks good, right? Has the rushing touchdown, has almost 50 yards, but as a decision maker, as an accurate thrower, still continues to struggle. And you wonder, have you heard anything this week in terms of who's getting the start? Is it going to be PJ Walker? Is it going to be Cam Newton?
Have not. It's something definitely going to want to monitor, but I can tell you one thing. If you're a defensive-minded head coach, you'd rather have a quarterback that was more erratic, that didn't turn the football over in P.J. Walker than Cam Newton, who has single-handedly created points for the opposition in recent weeks.
Yes, that was unfortunate for us and our listeners, and I think
unreal.
You're kind of in that 8-minute mark at 7-7, and you're kind of right outside. You're like right on the fringe of field goal territory, and so if 3rd and 6 is an incomplete pass instead of a pick six, right? Is a defensive-minded coach going to attempt a 54-yard field goal? He's unlikely to go for it on 4th and 6. Is he going to play the punt and pin game and allow his defensive line to try to wreak some havoc on Atlanta's questionable offensive line? Although they did perform pretty damn well yesterday, all things considered, Atlanta's offensive line. So that was the ultimate debate. If you get a punt and pin there, you're looking pretty good under 21 at 7-7 with roughly 7-8 minutes to go and an Atlanta offense potentially pinned back.
Yeah, definitely would have changed the dynamic. And the same way, things would have changed a little bit if Carolina doesn't go all-out blitz at midfield on 3rd and 11, forcing the Falcons into a punt situation before that game falls 17-7. But I digress. There's no doubt about it. A season that started exceptionally well for the Carolina Panthers. You begin to wonder the trajectory of where they're going. And if there should be a high-profile college football job opening, would teams be calling Matt Rule once the regular season is over in the National Football League? So, always interesting to see how, some of those things kind of change throughout the course of a season. I did want to ask you, Payne, we know that the situation in Jacksonville is an absolute dumpster fire, but you shot me a note during that game. It's a contest that I didn't spend a lot of time watching, but you had some relatively strong comments on Trevor Lawrence, all things considered.
Yeah, he's terrible. And I don't know. Listen, he's young. He obviously is not being coached very well. There's turmoil. There's not a lot of weapons there. But he's also not making good decisions. I mean, get rid of the football. You guys taking 15-yard sacks, just running around in the backfield. Not a good day yesterday, obviously. 4 interceptions, 35 quarterback rate, 6% below expectation in terms of completion percentage. You're hoping that he's not completely debilitated after what's transpired in year 1 as a rookie. And I don't know what's going to come in year 2. Is it going to be Urban? Is he going to ultimately bail again? But this isn't what Urban Meyer signed up for, but this is kind of what we envisioned, I think, from Urban Meyer. I did not envision Trevor Lawrence not being able to look competent, but I had a sneaky suspicion that Urban Meyer's offense would not work at this level. It's a very basic offense that is reliant upon having more talent. And he has always been a great recruiter, right? Listen to Kirby Smart. Players matter. And certainly they do at the NFL level, but the gap between great and good is very minimal, and great coaching can get good to the great level. In college, there's a massive difference between a 5-star kid and a 3-star kid. And you can coach up that 3-star kid all you want, and sure, you will have some diamonds in the rough. But talent wins in college football. You don't need the best coaching. And now all of a sudden, when the talent's a little bit more equal, we see Urban Meyer is not very good. And the cast of characters that he brought in to assemble his staff, we had question marks coming in. It was like the most obscure staff to be hired. As those guys continue to trickle in, I'm just thinking to myself, oh, that one's interesting. That one's interesting. I didn't even know Urban had a relationship with that guy. That doesn't even feel like a fit.
Well, to your point, Urban may not have had strong relationships because he did call all the guys losers and wants them to explain why they deserve their jobs to be surrounded by winners.
He's going to find out the mole. He's going to search out the mole. He's probably going to be less concerned with the Houston Texans this week and be more concerned searching out who the mole is, who the rat is, rather. And so that will be interesting. Very telling line, opening 3 this week against the Houston Texans.
Oh, one hell of a football game. I can't imagine that's going to be a game that we're going to spend a lot of time on Thursday, aka it will not be broken down in this podcast unless something drastically changes between now and then. But The good, the bad, and the ugly NFL Week 14 Bet the Board style. Trying to highlight some of the things that we've noticed that you can use going forward. And while the media wants to highlight certain things, oftentimes those storylines don't correlate to identifying betting value at the window going forward. FanDuel.com/bet the board. $1,000 risk-free bet. 30-1 enhanced odds on a lot of marquee games. Encourage all of you folks that don't already have an account with FanDuel to go ahead and do so. You can follow Payne on Twitter at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Furman. You can follow me there. Most importantly, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. Look ahead numbers, Payne, and we have seen some movement on a couple of these games, and we can start with Thursday night, the marquee matchup of the weekend, where the Chiefs were a 3-point favorite for their trip to SoFi against the Los Angeles Chargers. That number now has a hook attached to it.
It does. It's a soft hook, but there is a hook. And one, we know the Chargers don't have a very good home field advantage. Two, if you actually break down the first time these teams played each other, the Chiefs were substantially better the first three quarters and by a long mile. And at this point, the Chiefs defense is playing substantially better now than it was then. It is substantially healthier now than it then was, right? And so you had some early turnovers. That was kind of the start of the turnover bug. And they weren't like turnovers that were being forced. There were some drops, there were some deflections. It was a very weird variety of Chiefs turnovers. Now, at 3.5, it'll be interesting to see ultimately where the next position comes in. We'll have to monitor some situations for the Chargers specifically, right? What's the status of Derwin James? Is Asante Samuel finally going to return from his absence of concussions? Had a couple. I know they want to play it slow with him, but certainly a massive game for their season outlook. And so, break this down a little bit deeper here. But, if Derwin and Asante are out, certainly makes life a little bit easier for the Chiefs offense.
There is no doubt about that. And you also wonder how a first-year head coach will handle cultivating a game plan on a short week. Not always an easy task, even against an opponent that you faced earlier this season within the division. Another divisional matchup, we've seen a number move through the key of 3. The Eagles were a 2.5-point favorite on a look-ahead number. They're now out to -4. The Eagles will come into this game off a bye, playing host to Washington. Some questions about Taylor Heinicke, optimism that he will be available for the Washington football team as a starter, but you do have to monitor the status of scary Terry McLaurin, who left the game with the concussion against the Cowboys and finished his first NFL game without a single reception.
Yes. I think when you look at this one, we're out to as high as 4.5 some places. I know Taylor Heinicke has his MRI this morning. He claims he's going to be fine, that they evaded a larger injury, but he's clearly not going to be 100%, right? And he was commenting afterwards that the elbow was giving him more trouble than his knee, and he actually made mention of that it was giving him trouble prior to the start of the Dallas game. So some of the reason we saw some game day steam there. This one, in this one, I think, the Eagles are certainly a team that pro bettors like a little bit more than odds makers. And then you compound that with some issues there at quarterback for Taylor Heinicke. And then obviously the concussion with Terry McLaurin. Let's see if he's able to get cleared in time for this game. But you have a pretty analytically sound Eagles team with an entire week to prepare for an opponent that they are quite familiar with. I think 4 is probably the better number here than the 2.5 was.
Big game for Philadelphia, a chance to get to 500 and put themselves right in the thick of things as far as one of those final wildcard positions in the NFC. One of the bigger moves that you'll see this time of year taking place in Denver, your look-ahead number had the Bengals, a 3-point road favorite at FanDuel Sportsbook. That number has now flipped. The Broncos are out to a 1.5-point favorite.
Let's see if the Bengals are able to establish their ground game here. That is really going to be an interesting battle when I look at the Bengals offense against the Broncos defense. Vic Fangio has the secondary with Bryce Callahan returning this past week to match some of the parts that Cincinnati has in the pass game. The Bengals' run offense has not been as efficient recently as it was at the beginning of the season. Obviously, Joe Mixon should be a little bit healthier this week, was battling the flu bug last week. Denver has gotten healthier in their defensive front seven. They've gotten healthier along their offensive line. This is a huge game for both teams, but certainly quite the move here. 4.5 points from Cincinnati -3 out to now Denver being the favorite, and I'm not necessarily certain last week's performance going against a beaten and battered Lions team that didn't even have enough parts to field a full unit is necessarily reason enough for this to move 4.5 points.
Yeah, market, who knew that beating up on the Lions, and despite only having a 17-10 halftime lead, could have the market explode in your favor. But alas, here we are as we head towards Week 15. And last, but certainly not least, the game that's obviously moved because of injury news, the Packers. They were a 2.5-point favorite on the look-ahead number at the Baltimore Ravens. That number out to 6.5. And Payne, I'll go one step further, that if Lamar Jackson's officially ruled out, 6.5 may actually be a bargain buy if you want to get ahead of the market.
Yeah, this will certainly go above the 7, I would think, if Lamar Jackson is officially announced out. And why this could become a little bit more difficult to navigate is the matchups. Right? The reason we thought the best path to victory for Cleveland was to have Baker Mayfield throw on early downs and attack was the issues the Ravens are having in their secondary. Lots of guys beat up. Okay, so we knew Peters was out earlier in the season. Then Marlon Humphrey goes down. Then Jimmy Smith was out last week as well. So your top 3 cover guys. Let's monitor Jimmy Smith this week. But certainly the Packers have the quarterback and the parts to build a lead here and force Tyler Huntley as a thrower into a defense that is number 2 in pressure rate since Week 10 for the Packers. And a defense that plays with 5 defensive backs most of the time on the field. So that becomes interesting, right? And the one thing that we've discussed is the Ravens' inability to get their ground game going, and that's really how you have to be efficient against the Packers' defense. That is the one area where they're not the best. So all of a sudden, you kind of map out the game plan here in the matchup. It doesn't necessarily bode overly well for the Ravens.
Credit to the Packers sleepwalking through the first half, although they did take a haymaker from the Bears, finding a way to rally in the second half. The defense rose to the occasion, and it was Green Bay getting you to the window with a 45-30 victory despite taking professional money on Chicago. We'll see what the Packers can run it back with this weekend. Before, though, we get to all of those tantalizing Week 15 matchups, we do have one final crown jewel on the Week 14 schedule, and that, of course, is Monday Night Football. That'll take us out to the desert, Payne, where it's the Arizona Cardinals, a 2-point home favorite as they'll welcome in the Los Angeles Rams. Total on this game sits at 51 at FanDuel Sportsbook, and the Arizona Cardinals will enter a game against the Rams as the favorite for the first time since 2016. The Cardinals, they've been good in the division this year, 4-0 against the spread, won each of those divisional games by 7+ points, but the one thing we have seen up until the previous meeting between these two teams, the Rams had won and dominated against Arizona, winning 8 of the last 9. And it actually marked the first game that Sean McVay didn't cover against Arizona. The Cardinals' key to success in that first victory was a ground game where they ran the rock for 216 yards. It's actually the most rushing yards the Rams had given up on the ground since 2019. Arizona's been a great team away from home. They've been highly mediocre in their own building. I guess the most logical place to start when we break this game down before we get into the matchups would be with the number. The 3 that John talked about on Thursday that they hung didn't last all that long, and we've seen the number kind of fluctuate from 2 to 2.5 throughout the course of the betting life cycle on this particular price.
I think when you look in terms of bettors, finding out where we can actually place the Rams within the tier of our power ratings is important, right? And so let's see what the Rams are tonight. I think this just is a more meaningful game. Obviously, all games down the stretch are important, but it just feels really important for the Rams, right? Their confidence as a whole. Because right now, when I look at our power ratings, it's Tampa by a pretty good bit, and then there's this like 1B clump of 3 to 4 teams, and the Rams are still within that clump. But if they don't look the part tonight, and your only positive effort over the last 5 weeks is at home against Jacksonville, that's a concern. And so in saying that, the most impactful bettors to this market did take 3 on the Rams. Now, late last night, a group that is somewhat newly formed out of Chicago did lay the Cardinals money line. I haven't done anything to this point, and I do know the total. It's very scary, but there has been some sharp money on the under at 52 and 51.5. Obviously, 51 is a key, but we're kind of even trending a little bit potentially under that 51 when you look at both defenses that I think are getting a little bit disrespected in this matchup. So that's what I've seen, at least from a price and informational standpoint.
You mentioned the Rams and this team being one that's relatively difficult to figure out, and I think part of the contributing factors there, since beating the Bucs back in Week 3, the Rams are 0-4 this year against teams that have a record better than 500, and they've been dominated in those contests. Their point per game differential worse than 2 touchdowns. Now, of course, we have contests like the Tennessee Titans where the box score didn't suggest they should have lost that football game, but nonetheless, here we are. When you look at this Rams offense, you talked a little bit about it. Matthew Stafford bounces back against Jacksonville. Snapped a 3-game streak of throwing a pick six, completed over 65% of his passes for the first time since Week 8. The offensive line gave him protection. He was sacked only once. And when you look at Stafford, he's been sacked 17 times this season, but 9 of them came during that Rams 3-game losing streak. This offense, we talked about trying to figure out its identity. We know Cooper Kupp grabs all the headlines, but Robert Woods did a lot of the dirty work. Sony Michel gets on track running the football. When you're looking to devise a game plan to attack this Arizona defense, is it as simple and straightforward as keeping Matthew Stafford upright and using a balanced attack to at least allow the Cardinals, or prevent the Cardinals, from pinning their ears back and coming after the quarterback?
Yeah, I think that sounds like the best path, right? And now it becomes a little bit more difficult because your starting center, Brian Allen, is out, and that is a substantial loss at an impact position. Allen's graded out the 5th best player on the Rams offense. So in terms of preventing pressure and keeping Matthew Stafford clean, being able to pinpoint pre-snap where pressure is going to come from, because you do have some solid linebackers that are versatile for the Cardinals that can come and blitz. That is substantial. Darrell Henderson appears to be out, and so I don't typically think running backs are a massive loss, but could be tonight. Sony Michel filled in okay last week, but when you look on how you attack Arizona, you can get them in the ground game. They're 22nd in EPA per rush allowed since Week 8. And so they're trending downwards in that regard. And we know McVay does like to have his run game go because he believes it's a massive component to the other things that they're going to do through the air. When you look at Arizona in totality, 2nd in EPA per play allowed, a lot of that is the ridiculousness transpiring on 3rd down. The Cardinals on 3rd down defensively are out of this world, and I think that's why it's even more important tonight for the Rams ground game to be effective on early downs. But Arizona, number 1 by a massive amount in 3rd and 4th down efficiency. I mean, the Cardinals are only giving up 3.2 yards per pass on 3rd down. So you're going to have to be able to protect Matthew Stafford this evening. I think you mentioned Woods being out. Let's see if OBJ, now that he's a little bit healthier, a little bit more integrated into the offense, if he continues to pick up a larger load. Now, again, against Jacksonville's defense without its best cover corner, he's going to look okay. But the guy who's really been impactful since the loss of Woods is Van Jefferson. His role's increased. Since Woods went down, both the snap share and target share have increased in a big way, over 22% target rate since Woods went down for Van Jefferson. So he's going to now need to step up a little bit more as well. And if you can get that and OBJ returns to the form we think he can perform at, things start to look a little bit better for this offense. I think the other interesting thing here is what Vance Joseph does on Cooper Kupp. He had a very good strategy in the first game, and Byron Murphy was part of that, but they did some bracket coverage. They changed their style a little bit in the secondary in this matchup, so it'll be interesting to see what Vance comes out with for the second iteration of this. But Cooper Kupp, 5 catches for 64 yards on 13 targets in the first matchup. So those are some of the little intricate things to look for in this game. Again, I don't necessarily have a play on this one, so I'm a little indifferent.
Other side of the ball, when you look at Arizona offensively against this Rams defense, we know familiar foes will reacquaint themselves with one another, specifically Jalen Ramsey and DeAndre Hopkins, who know each other from their time in the AFC South. Kyler Murray puts together good fantasy numbers last week, accounting for 4 touchdowns against the Bears, but really didn't have to do a whole heck of a lot. James Conner has obviously been a positive revelation for this Arizona Cardinals team. 14 touchdowns this season, touchdowns in 6 straight. It's actually the longest streak for an Arizona Cardinal since one of your proudest Florida State alums in Anquan Boldin accomplished a feat back in 2008. The Rams defensively, Payne, the secondary has played well, but you haven't really had to attack the secondary early and often, knowing that the run defense has been a little bit of a liability.
It is. Let's start with where you led us, and it's DeAndre Hopkins and Jalen Ramsey. They faced each other 10 times in head-to-head matchups, as you mentioned there, with the AFC South battles with Jacksonville and Houston. Jalen Ramsey speaks very highly of DeAndre Hopkins. Always says it's one of the toughest matchups he's had. The numbers would indicate otherwise. And so right now, in the 10 head-to-head matchups, DeAndre Hopkins has been targeted 77 times. Ramsey's only allowed 38 receptions for 462 yards. So Hopkins has only been able to catch 49% of his targets for about 6 yards a target on Ramsey. So I think the big thing here with the Cardinals offensively is they do have these other weapons now. So if Hopkins is removed, you have other guys that are fully capable of exploiting their matchups. And that has really been the problem with the Rams defense is who else in the secondary steps up in a game like this if Jalen's removing Hopkins. Chase Edmonds looks like he is going to be up. Obviously had a huge role in the upset win against the Rams earlier in the season. He was good catching the balls out of the backfield. He was great in the run game. Let's also keep an eye on Justin Pugh. The Rams are number 1 in pass rush win rate, so having a key cog back along the Arizona offensive line would be big. It is a calf injury. He's been limited all week. I don't know. They've really been conservative with their injuries because it's Super Bowl or bust for Arizona, so might not be a reason to throw him out there unless he's 100% tonight. But what is interesting about this and why they ultimately went and got Von Miller is because that's great that you're winning your one-on-one matchups. And as I alluded to, the Rams are number 1 in pass rush win rate. But it's so bizarre. They don't create a ton of pressure, as bizarre as that sounds. The Rams are below average in pressure rate. They're 22nd in actual pressure rate, 17th in adjusted sack rate. That's got to change tonight, right? You got to get after Kyler Murray. You have to get after him the right way to contain him within the pocket. And if you don't contain him within the pocket, then it's a little bit of some trouble there. One interesting development, and you start to read articles and listen to some pressers, and there's a guy that everyone's talked about this week, Ernest Johnson. Whether it's Von Miller, whether it's Aaron Donald, 2 guys that are obviously well-respected, they've all talked about how impactful the linebacker Ernest Jones is tonight because of his versatility, his speed, his coverage ability, and that speed being a key component to possibly helping keep Kyler's legs contained. So let's look for that. He only played 10 snaps in the first meeting, but everyone seems to be raving about his performance and how he's trending and his ability to roam sideline to sideline and keep Kyler in the pocket tonight. So that'll be something to look for here. Again, this is kind of a game for me that's troubling because this is your classic like pros versus Joes in a standalone Monday Night Football game. And so every ounce of me says that the Rams +3 are the right side, and then you start to dig into some of these matchups and you don't necessarily love them. And so you get conflicted. And so ultimately these are games that I just find myself on the sidelines for.
Hey, there's some games that are out there that create great opportunities from a betting perspective, and there's others that you kind of want to take a step back and observe even this late in the season as you try and identify who these football teams are. And when you look at the Arizona Cardinals, we know it's a group that hasn't been beloved by the betting markets, but somewhere along the way, when you're 10-2 and have the metrics that they're producing, it's not all smoke and mirrors. They're not the NFC equivalent of the Tennessee Titans, whose negative net yards per play said there was inevitably going to be a regression. I mean, Arizona is doing some of the things. They're getting their superstars healthy, and they have a chance to clinch their first playoff berth since 2015 if they're able to sweep the season series from the Rams and more or less secure the NFC West and focus on that number 1 overall seed in the conference.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. This goes a long way because that first round bye is, to me, really massive this year. But Arizona's done a very good job navigating the injury situation and finding enough depth to overcome that. And so now that you come out of the bye and you are on the good side of the injuries with key components in Kyler and Hopkins, suddenly it's like, hey, let's make this push for the Super Bowl. And ultimately you can kind of derail the Rams here, and you want to keep pace, right? Like Tampa was able to win yesterday, and I just think getting Tampa Bay away from home is the way that you're potentially going to give them trouble. They're just a different animal at home. And you kind of sense why, right? I mean, it's warm weather. Got a lot of older guys on that roster. But I think it's crucial for a team like Arizona to have home field advantage.
One last thing I wanted to ask you about, and then we can kind of wrap things up around these parts for Arizona. Anomaly or something to worry about when you look at how dominant they've been away from home, flirting with history in terms of margin of victory and dominant performances. But in their own building, one that we had talked about years ago being more of the unheralded home field advantage, just hasn't been there. In 3 of 5 home games this year, they've scored 21 points or less and put forth some real duds, even for what has been a tremendous season, at least through their first 12 games.
Yeah, I mean, if you could tell me why, then I'd tell you that there was some merit to it. I couldn't tell you because you are spot on. Like 3 or 4 years ago, we were downgrading Arizona substantially when they hit the highway. They were a monster home team, not a very good road team. And now the inverse is happening, and I couldn't necessarily tell you why. Maybe there's some complacency there when you look at some of the teams that they've played in their home building. But I don't know the reason for it.
I'm going to blame the training table. Got to be something going on in that pregame meal that's weighing everybody down. I mean, Kyler did look a little puffy when he was shelved for a couple weeks, not to body shame or anything around there. But no, all kidding aside, we'll see if Arizona, biggest game that they've had so far this season at home. The only other time we saw them on a standalone stage, they underwhelmed, losing outright to the Green Bay Packers, coming up just a few yards short in that contest. So we'll see what they can put forth tonight. Anything else, my friend, that you would like to add before we take a little 72-hour break and come back refreshed, renewed, with a positive outlook for NFL Week 15?
That is everything. We are good to go.
All righty. I would encourage all of you, our loyal listeners, to follow Payne on Twitter at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Furman. You can follow me there. Most importantly, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. Best of luck with all of your Monday Night Football investments between the Rams and Cardinals. And regardless of which direction you go in, hopefully we'll see you at the window.